Power is a dangerous drug, especially in the hands of those who have never earned it. When Officer Shane Whitaker slapped cold steel handcuffs onto the wrists of a petite, quietly observant black woman in an upscale suburban park, he thought he was just teaching a nobody a lesson in authority. He smirked as he shoved her into the back of his cruiser, deaf to her calm, measured warnings. What Officer Whitaker didn't know was that he hadn't just crossed a line. He had blindly stumbled into a minefield. He had just declared war on Elena Vargas, a ruthless, nationally recognized civil rights litigator who destroyed careers before her morning coffee. Karma wasn't just coming for the precinct. It was already sitting in their holding cell, wearing a faded hoodie, and mentally drafting their ruin. Oak Creek Estates was the kind of neighborhood where the silence was expensive. Manicured lawns rolled down to a private lake, and the houses were set so far back from the winding, tree-lined streets that they looked like secluded fortresses. Elena Vargas had purchased her spacious modern home there after winning a landmark class-action lawsuit against a corrupt pharmaceutical giant. In her early 40s, Elena was at the absolute pinnacle of her career. As a senior named partner at the elite firm of Reynolds, Vargas, and Hayes, her life was a blur of high-stakes depositions, federal courtrooms, and relentless strategy, which was exactly why, on a crisp evening, she looked absolutely nothing like a top-tier attorney. Exhausted from a long week, Elena had shed her custom-tailored suits for an oversized faded Yale Law hoodie, worn-in gray sweatpants, and a pair of scuffed running shoes. Her hair was pulled up into a messy bun. She just wanted a short walk of peace, walking her golden retriever, Barnaby, around the neighborhood lake. She was sitting on a wrought iron park bench, watching the sunset reflect off the water, when the heavy crunch of tires on gravel broke the evening quiet. A black and white cruiser from the local precinct rolled to a halt nearby. The spotlight mounted on the driver's side flicked on, cutting through the twilight and hitting Elena right in the eyes. She squinted, raising a hand to shield her face. Barnaby let out a low, confused woof, sitting close to her leg. The doors popped open. 2 officers stepped out. Officer Shane Whitaker was a man built like a brick wall with a tight buzz cut and an aggressive, forward-leaning posture that practically radiated unearned authority. His partner, Officer Caleb Torres, was younger, thinner, and looked significantly less enthusiastic, trailing a few steps behind. "Evening," Whitaker barked, his voice loud enough to disturb the tranquil neighborhood. He didn't approach with the casual demeanor of community policing. He walked with his hand resting on his utility belt, right near his taser. "Good evening, officers," Elena replied calmly, remaining seated. She gave them a polite but reserved nod. "We got a call about a suspicious person loitering in the park," Whitaker said, stopping a few feet from the bench. He looked Elena up and down, his eyes taking in the baggy sweatpants, the dark skin, the complete lack of visible wealth. His lip curled slightly. "Parks for residents only. I am aware," Elena said, her voice smooth and even. "It's a beautiful evening for a walk." "I didn't ask for a weather report," Whitaker snapped. "I need to see some identification." Elena's legal mind, usually turned down to a low simmer during her evening walks, instantly clicked into high gear. She recognized the tone. She had cross-examined 100 cops just like Whitaker, men who operated on ego and assumption rather than probable cause. "Am I suspected of committing a crime, officer?" Elena asked, her tone entirely devoid of intimidation. Under Terry v. Ohio, she knew they needed reasonable, articulable suspicion to demand identification. Simply sitting on a park bench in a baggy hoodie didn't meet the threshold. Whitaker narrowed his eyes. The fact that she didn't instantly scramble to obey him felt like a direct insult to his badge. "I just told you we got a call about a suspicious person. Now hand over your ID. I don't carry my wallet when I walk my dog," Elena said truthfully. "My house is just up the hill. I am a resident here." "Right. And I'm the mayor," Whitaker scoffed. He took a step closer, invading her personal space. "Stand up." Officer Torres shifted uncomfortably. "Shane, maybe we just ask her for her name and run it." "Shut up, Torres," Whitaker muttered, not taking his eyes off Elena. "I told you to stand up." Elena remained seated. She placed a calming hand on Barnaby's head. "Officer, I am perfectly within my rights to sit here. I have broken no laws. If I am not being detained, I would like to finish my walk." "You're detained!" Whitaker barked. He lunged forward and grabbed Elena by her upper arm. His grip was entirely disproportionate to the situation. His fingers dug painfully into her bicep through the thick fabric of the hoodie. Barnaby, sensing the sudden hostility, stood up and barked sharply at the officer. "Control your mutt, or I'll put it down," Whitaker yelled, his hand dropping dangerously to his holster. Elena's heart spiked, not with fear for herself, but for her dog. She stood up abruptly, pulling Barnaby's leash tight and putting her body firmly between the animal and the officer. "Do not threaten my dog," she said, her voice dropping an octave, ringing with a sudden, icy authority that normally made hostile witnesses sweat. "I am complying. I am standing." "You're resisting," Whitaker shouted, though she was standing perfectly still. It was a textbook escalation tactic. Before Elena could utter another word, Whitaker spun her around roughly. He shoved her forward, slamming her chest and face against the cold metal hood of the cruiser. Pain flared in her cheekbone as it struck the steel. "Hey, Shane, take it easy," Torres hissed, finally stepping forward. "She's not fighting. She refused a lawful order," Whitaker snarled. He grabbed Elena's wrists. Twisting her left arm up painfully high behind her back, he unclipped his handcuffs. "Officer," Elena said, her voice muffled against the hood of the car, but still steady. "You are violating my Fourth Amendment rights. You have no probable cause for an arrest, and you are using excessive force. I strongly advise you to think about what you are doing." "Are you giving me legal advice now?" Whitaker laughed harshly. Click. Click. The cold steel snapped around her left wrist. He grabbed her right wrist and wrenched it back. Click, click. The cuffs were intentionally tight, biting into her skin. "You have the right to remain silent. I suggest you start using it." He didn't read her the rest of her Miranda rights. He simply grabbed her by the back of her hoodie and shoved her toward the rear door of the cruiser. As Whitaker pushed her down into the hard plastic seat of the squad car, Elena didn't scream. She didn't cry. She sat back, looked out the window at the familiar trees of her neighborhood, and took a slow, deep breath. The anger inside her was a cold, pure thing. Whitaker had just handed her a loaded weapon, and he didn't even realize the safety was off. The ride to the precinct was suffocatingly tense. The heavy plexiglass divider separated the front seats from the back, but it did nothing to block out Whitaker's smug commentary. "Always the same with these people," Whitaker muttered to Torres, though he was clearly speaking loudly enough for Elena to hear. "Think because they sneak into a nice neighborhood, they can do whatever they want. Probably casing houses." Torres kept his eyes glued to the dark road. "Shane, we didn't even run her name. What are we charging her with?" "Disorderly conduct, resisting arrest, failure to identify. Take your pick. I'll write the paper," Whitaker said, tapping the steering wheel to the rhythm of the radio. "She'll sit in holding overnight, realize she isn't as tough as she thinks she is, and take a plea deal by morning." In the back seat, Elena was absolutely silent. She was busy. Her mind was a steel trap cataloging every detail, every word spoken, every procedural violation. Violation 1. Unlawful detention without reasonable suspicion. Violation 2. Assault and battery under color of law. Violation 3. False arrest. Violation 4. Failure to read Miranda rights upon taking into custody. Violation 5. Malicious prosecution pending the falsified report. She mentally noted the badge numbers she had memorized off their chests. Whitaker, number 4892. Torres, number 5104. She noted the squad car number. She noted the exact time of the arrest. By the time the cruiser pulled into the dimly lit sally port of the precinct, Elena had already mapped out the federal civil rights lawsuit she was going to drop on the city like an anvil. Whitaker dragged her out of the car. Her shoulders ached from having her arms pinned behind her back, but she kept her posture straight and her expression blank. She allowed herself to be marched through the heavy steel doors and into the chaotic, fluorescent-lit booking area. The room smelled of stale coffee, old sweat, and pine sol. Telephones were ringing, and a few other detainees were slumped on benches waiting to be processed. Behind the high desk sat Desk Sergeant Leonard Shaw, a heavy-set man with a deeply bored expression. He barely looked up as Whitaker shoved Elena toward the counter. "What do we have, Whitaker?" Shaw sighed, typing sluggishly on a keyboard. "Refusal to identify, resisting arrest, disorderly conduct," Whitaker rattled off, leaning on the counter. "Caught her prowling around Oak Creek Estates. Gave me a hard time." Shaw finally looked at Elena. He saw the faded Yale hoodie, the messy hair, the dirt on her sweatpants from being slammed against the car. "Name?" Shaw asked. "I demand my one phone call," Elena said, her voice cutting through the noise of the room. It was crisp, authoritative, and completely out of place in a booking room. Shaw blinked, surprised by her tone. "You'll get your call after booking. Name?" "My name is Elena Vargas," she said clearly, "and I am invoking my right to counsel. I will not answer any processing questions. I will not submit to fingerprinting. And I will not sign any documents until I have spoken to my attorney." Whitaker scoffed loudly. "Listen to her! She watches one episode of Law and Order and thinks she's a lawyer." Elena slowly turned her head to look at Whitaker. Her dark eyes were perfectly calm, yet they held a weight that made the officer momentarily break eye contact. "Officer Whitaker, you have made a series of catastrophic career decisions tonight. I highly suggest you allow the sergeant to grant me my phone call." "Put her in holding cell 3, Whitaker snapped at Torres, his face flushing with anger. "Let her cool off. We'll process her when she's ready to cooperate." "Shane, we have to book her to hold her," Torres started. "I said put her in the cell," Whitaker barked. Torres swallowed hard, gently taking Elena's elbow. "Come on, ma'am, just walk with me." Elena allowed Torres to lead her down a narrow, dirty cinder block hallway. He unlocked the heavy barred door of cell 3. It was empty, containing nothing but a steel bench attached to the wall and an exposed toilet in the corner. Before she stepped in, Torres uncuffed her. Elena rubbed her raw, red wrists, noting the deep indentations left by the metal. "Look," Torres muttered, keeping his voice low so Whitaker couldn't hear. "Just give them your ID. Apologize to Shane. He's a hothead. But if you just apologize, he might just write it up as a warning and let you walk." Elena looked at the young officer. She saw the fear in his eyes, fear of his partner, fear of stepping out of line. But fear didn't excuse complicity. "Officer Torres," Elena said softly, "you watched a fellow officer assault an innocent citizen. You failed to intervene. You are currently participating in a false imprisonment. Your advice is entirely useless to me, but I suggest you retain independent counsel by tomorrow morning." Torres stared at her, utterly bewildered, as she stepped into the cell. The heavy door clanged shut behind her, the lock sliding home with a final, echoing thud. Elena sat down on the cold steel bench. The temperature in the cell was freezing. She pulled her knees up to her chest, wrapping the oversized hoodie around her legs. She waited. She knew the game. They would leave her there for hours, hoping the isolation, the cold, and the uncertainty would break her spirit. They wanted her crying, begging, ready to agree to whatever bogus charges they put on paper just to go home. But Elena didn't break. For hours, she sat in absolute, terrifying silence. She didn't pace. She didn't yell for the guards. She closed her eyes and methodically built the legal guillotine she was going to use to sever the city's budget. It was late when the heavy door to the holding corridor finally banged open. Officer Torres walked down the hall, his boots echoing off the concrete. He stopped in front of cell 3, looking deeply uncomfortable. Elena opened her eyes. She hadn't moved from her spot on the bench. "Sergeant Shaw said you can have your call now," Torres said, unlocking the door. Elena stood up, smoothing down her wrinkled hoodie. She walked past Torres without a word, projecting an aura of dignity that made the dirty hallway feel like a courtroom. She followed him back to the booking desk. The precinct was quieter now, running on a skeleton night crew. Whitaker was sitting in a rolling chair behind the desk, eating a slice of greasy pizza, laughing at something on a computer screen. He barely glanced at her as she was handed a heavy black landline receiver attached to the wall. "Make it quick," Whitaker mumbled around a mouthful of cheese. "Then you're getting fingerprinted." Elena picked up the receiver and punched in a familiar number. She didn't call a family member. She called the emergency private cell phone of David Thornton, the founding partner of Reynolds, Vargas, and Hayes. The phone rang twice before a groggy, deep voice answered. "Thornton?" "David, it's Elena," she said. Her voice was calm, but the undercurrent of steel made it clear this was not a social call. There was a rustling of sheets on the other end, and instantly the sleep vanished from David's voice. "Elena, it's late. Where are you?" "I am currently incarcerated at the precinct," Elena said, speaking clearly enough for the officers behind the desk to hear if they were listening. "I have been unlawfully detained, assaulted, and falsely arrested under bogus charges by an officer, Shane Whitaker." Behind the desk, Whitaker stopped chewing. He looked over at her, his brow furrowing. Incarcerated. Unlawfully detained. The vocabulary was entirely too precise. "Excuse me? You were arrested." David's voice dropped into the dangerous, lethal register he used when destroying expert witnesses on the stand. "Are you injured?" "Bruised cheekbone, lacerated wrists from excessively tight cuffs, minor physical injuries, major civil rights violations," Elena reported clinically. "I need you to mobilize the crisis team. Call the district attorney. No, skip him. Wake up the attorney general if you have to. I want a preservation of all precinct security footage, body cam footage, and dash cam footage from the squad car from the time of the stop onward." "And David?" "Yes? Bring the hounds. We are on our way," David said, and the line went dead. Elena hung up the phone. She turned around to face the desk. Whitaker was staring at her, the pizza crust dangling from his fingers. Sergeant Shaw had stopped typing. The atmosphere in the room had shifted, a sudden, inexplicable drop in barometric pressure. "Who did you call?" Whitaker asked, a sneer trying to mask the sudden flutter of unease in his chest. "Your public defender." Elena walked over to the desk and placed her hands flat on the counter. She looked at Sergeant Shaw, ignoring Whitaker entirely. "Sergeant Shaw," she said, her voice echoing in the quiet room. "I am Elena Vargas, managing partner at Reynolds, Vargas, and Hayes. I specialize in federal civil rights litigation, specifically police misconduct." Shaw froze. The blood drained from his face so fast he looked slightly gray. He slowly reached out and pulled the keyboard toward him. He typed Elena Vargas into the search bar. "In a short while," Elena continued smoothly, "the senior partners of my firm will walk through those doors. They will be accompanied by an injunction to seize all digital data in this building. Tomorrow morning, I will be filing a federal civil suit against the city, this precinct, and Officer Whitaker personally, seeking damages in the high 8 figures." Shaw hit enter on his keyboard. A Google results page populated instantly. the entire screen filled with images of the woman standing in front of him. There she was, wearing sharp designer suits, standing on the steps of the Supreme Court. There was a Forbes article titled, "The Unstoppable Force: How Elena Vargas Broke the NYPD's Qualified Immunity." There was a Wikipedia page detailing her staggering win rate against corrupt city officials. Shaw swallowed heavily. His eyes darted from the screen to the woman in the dirty sweatpants and back to the screen. "Oh, sweet, merciful God," Shaw whispered, horrified. "What?" Whitaker demanded, standing up and leaning over Shaw's shoulder to look at the screen. He squinted at the monitor. He read the headlines. He saw the pictures. For several seconds, the booking room was so silent you could hear the hum of the fluorescent lights. Officer Shane Whitaker, the man who had slammed her against a hood and mocked her for knowing her rights, slowly stepped back from the computer. The swagger melted off him like wax in a furnace. His face turned a sickly, ashen white. He looked at Elena, truly looking at her for the first time, and realized he hadn't arrested a civilian. He had arrested an apex predator. You didn't have any ID?" Whitaker stammered, his voice suddenly weak, high-pitched, defensive. "You didn't have probable cause, Shane," Elena countered, using his first name with lethal precision. "And ignorance of the law is no excuse. Isn't that what you boys like to say?" Before anyone could move, the heavy glass double doors at the front of the precinct blew open. It wasn't a single lawyer. It was an invasion. David Thornton, a tall, imposing man with silver hair and a bespoke charcoal suit, marched into the room. He was flanked by 3 other partners, all dressed impeccably despite the late hour. Behind them walked a court stenographer and a man carrying a massive, locked briefcase that looked entirely too official. David didn't stop at the visitors' line. He walked straight past the wooden barrier, his expensive Italian leather shoes clicking aggressively on the linoleum. "Who is the commanding officer of this precinct?" David boomed, his voice rattling the glass windows of the offices. Sergeant Shaw shot up from his chair, practically knocking it over. Captain Donovan, sir. But he's asleep in his office." "Wake him up," David commanded, pointing a long finger at Shaw. "Wake him up right now and tell him David Thornton is here to collect his partner. And tell him to bring his badge, because by tomorrow afternoon, he's going to be handing it in." David turned and looked at Elena. He saw the red, swollen marks on her wrists where the cuffs had dug in. He saw the faint, dark bruising beginning to form on her cheekbone. The fury that crossed the older lawyer's face made even Officer Torres take a step back. "Elena?" David said, his voice dropping to a softer but no less intense register. "Are you all right?" "I'm perfectly fine, David," Elena said, a cold, shark-like smile finally touching her lips. She turned her eyes slowly toward Whitaker, who was currently trying to shrink into the corner behind the desk. "In fact, I'm feeling incredibly inspired." Footsteps pounded down the hallway behind the booking desk. Captain Victor Lang practically burst through his office door, still hurriedly buttoning his uniform shirt over his undershirt. His face was a mask of sleep-deprived confusion that rapidly morphed into absolute terror as he took in the scene. David Thornton stood in the center of the room, flanked by his legal team, radiating an icy, uncompromising wrath. And sitting calmly on the detainee bench, nursing bruised wrists, was Elena Varga. Lang had been on the force for decades. He knew every major player in the city's legal ecosystem. Seeing Elena Vargas sitting in his booking area wearing a dirty hoodie and handcuff marks was the equivalent of walking into his precinct and finding a live, ticking nuclear warhead on the floor. "Mr. Thornton!" Lang choked out, his voice cracking. He rushed forward, pushing past Whitaker, who was practically hyperventilating against the wall. What is the meaning of this? Why is Ms. Vargas here?" That is exactly the question you need to be asking Officer Shane Whitaker, David snapped, his voice echoing off the cinder block walls. Because your officer decided to profile, assault, and falsely arrest my managing partner while she was walking her dog in her own neighborhood. Lang spun around, his eyes locking onto Whitaker. The captain's face turned a mottled, dangerous shade of purple. Shane, tell me you didn't. Whitaker opened his mouth, but only a dry rasp came out. Captain, she refused to identify herself. She was resisting. I was sitting on a park bench, Elena interrupted, her voice entirely devoid of emotion, cutting through Whitaker's panic like a scalpel. I informed your officer that I lived nearby. Without reasonable suspicion, he demanded my identification. When I calmly asserted my Fourth Amendment rights, he threatened to shoot my dog, slammed my face into his cruiser, and applied his handcuffs with malicious intent to cause physical pain. Lang looked physically ill. He pressed a hand to his forehead, closing his eyes. Ms. Vargas, please let me get you out of here immediately. This is a catastrophic misunderstanding. We can handle this internally. Shane is a hothead, but internal affairs is a joke, Captain. And you know it, Elena said, slowly standing up. The room went dead silent as she approached the wooden divider. But let me correct you on one thing. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was a statistical inevitability. She looked back at David, who gave a sharp nod. One of the junior partners unclasped the heavy, locked briefcase he had brought in, pulling out a thick, leather-bound dossier. For the past couple of years, my firm has been compiling a database on this precinct, Elena explained, her dark eyes locking onto Lang's. We have cataloged hundreds of complaints of unconstitutional stops, excessive force, and racial profiling targeting minorities passing through Oak Creek Estates and the surrounding affluent districts. A significant portion of those complaints trace back to Officer Whitaker and his immediate shift supervisors. Whitaker's knees actually buckled slightly. He gripped the edge of the desk to keep from sliding to the linoleum floor. Officer Caleb Torres, standing near the holding cells, went completely pale, realizing he had just become collateral damage in a massive federal sting. You see, Captain, Elena continued, her voice soft but lethal. The problem with suing a police department is qualified immunity. It shields officers from civil liability unless they violate clearly established statutory or constitutional rights. It requires a perfect plaintiff, someone with no criminal record, perfect conduct during the arrest, and the resources to fight a protracted legal battle. She gestured to her hoodie and sweatpants. I bought my house in Oak Creek recently. Every evening, I walk my dog around that lake wearing exactly this outfit. I didn't bait him. I simply existed in a space where Shane Whitaker believes people who look like me do not belong. I knew that eventually the data would prove true. I just had to wait for him to make the mistake. Lang was staring at her in absolute horror. You planned this. I prepared for it, Elena corrected sharply. Officer Whitaker made the active choice to violate the Constitution. Now the precinct is going to pay for it. She turned to David. Are the preservation letters served? Signed by Judge William Cole moments ago, David confirmed, handing a stack of legal documents to the trembling Sergeant Shaw. No one deletes a single email, wipes a body cam, or overwrites a dash cam. If a single byte of data goes missing between now and sunrise, I will have the FBI down here for obstruction of justice. Lang turned slowly to Whitaker. The captain didn't yell. The fury had transcended shouting. It was a cold, absolute realization that his precinct was about to be burned to the ground. Badge and gun, Shane, Lang whispered. Captain, please, Whitaker begged, tears actually springing to his eyes. He thought of his pension. He thought of his mortgage. He thought of his wife, who was currently asleep at home, unaware that their lives were completely over. Right now, Lang roared, the sound deafening in the small room. Trembling uncontrollably, Whitaker unclipped his heavy-duty belt. It hit the desk with a heavy, final thud. He unpinned the silver shield from his chest, his fingers numb, and slid it across the counter. Elena watched the metal badge slide across the scratched laminate. She didn't smile. Vengeance wasn't about joy. It was about equilibrium. "I suggest you call your union representative, Mr. Whitaker," Elena said quietly as she turned toward the exit. "Though given the exposure you've just brought upon the city, I highly doubt they will cover your private legal fees." Morning broke over the city, but the real heat wasn't coming from the sun. It was radiating from the steps of the federal courthouse. By morning, the story had leaked. It wasn't just a leak. It was a calculated flood. David Thornton hadn't just called a judge. He had called Laura Bennett, the most aggressive investigative journalist at the city's largest paper. When Officer Shane Whitaker woke up after a sleepless, nauseating night on his living room couch, he turned on the local news to see his own face dominating the screen. Top civil rights attorney brutalized in Oak Creek. Massive lawsuit imminent. But the news anchor wasn't just reading a statement. They were playing a video. Across the lake from where Elena was arrested, a homeowner had installed a high-definition, military-grade security camera system. The camera had perfectly captured the cruiser pulling up, the blinding spotlight, and Whitaker violently shoving a compliant, stationary woman against the hood of the car. The audio was faint, but clear enough over the water. The threat to shoot the dog. The demand for ID without cause. Whitaker watched, sick to his stomach, as legal analysts on multiple networks dismantled his career in real time. His cell phone rang. It was the president of the police union. "Shane." The voice on the other end was grim, devoid of the usual fraternal warmth. "I just got off the phone with the mayor's office. Listen, the video looks bad out of context, but she was—" "Shut up, Shane. Just shut up," the union president snapped. "There is no context that saves you here. You assaulted Elena Vargas. Do you have any idea what she does to cities? She bankrupts them. The mayor is screaming for a head on a pike to stop the bleeding. The union is officially withdrawing legal support for your civil defense. We cannot attach our treasury to this level of liability." "You're abandoning me?" Whitaker croaked, the room spinning. "You abandoned protocol. You're on your own. Hire a private lawyer. You're going to need one." The line clicked dead. Meanwhile, inside the sprawling, mahogany-paneled conference room of Reynolds, Vargas, and Hayes, the atmosphere was electric. Elena sat at the head of the massive table, dressed in a flawless, tailored navy suit. The bruising on her cheek was visible. She had specifically instructed her makeup artist not to conceal it. It was a badge of honor, a piece of evidence. Across the table sat District Attorney Marcus Thorne and Police Commissioner Harlan Pierce. Both men looked as though they had aged years overnight. "Elena David," D.A. Thorne began, wiping sweat from his brow despite the aggressive air conditioning. "We want to resolve this quickly and quietly. All charges against you have been formally dropped and expunged. We are prepared to offer a settlement of several $million paid out from the city's discretionary fund. No trial, no media circus." Elena leaned forward, resting her chin on her steepled hands. She let the silence stretch, watching the two powerful men squirm under her gaze. "Several million," Elena repeated softly. "Marcus, my firm bills out at a high hourly rate. Do I look like a woman who needs several million?" "Miss Vargas," Commissioner Pierce interjected, trying to project authority. "We have already suspended Officer Whitaker without pay. We are taking internal disciplinary action. We are addressing the issue." "You are applying a Band-Aid to a tumor, Harlan," Elena countered sharply. She opened a thick folder and slid 3 documents across the polished wood table. "Here are my terms for settlement," Elena said, her voice ringing with absolute finality. "First, $30 million, not from the discretionary fund, from the police pension fund. Make the officers feel the financial consequence of harboring bad cops. Pierce gasped. "That's impossible. The union will strike." "Let them strike," Elena fired back. Second, the immediate termination of Captain Lang for failure to supervise and maintain constitutional standards within his precinct. Third, Officer Shane Whitaker will not be allowed to resign quietly. He will be fired with cause, stripping him of his pension. Furthermore, the district attorney's office will file criminal charges against him for assault under color of law. Thorne swallowed hard. "Elena, charging a cop criminally, that requires a grand jury. It's a political nightmare." "Then I guess we're going to trial," Elena said smoothly, reaching for the documents to pull them back. "And in discovery, I will depose every single officer in the precinct under oath. I will subpoena your internal communications, Harlan. I will expose every racial slur sent over squad car terminals, every buried use of force complaint. And I will do it on national television. I will make sure the Department of Justice puts this city under a federal consent decree for years to come." She locked eyes with the district attorney. "I am not looking for an apology, Marcus. I am looking for an amputation. Sign the agreement, or I will see you in federal court on Monday." The two men stared at the documents. They looked at the bruises on her wrists, peeking out from the cuffs of her silk blouse. They realized they had absolutely no leverage. They were trapped in a cage with a tiger, and they had locked the door themselves. Slowly, with a trembling hand, District Attorney Thorne reached for his pen. Karma wasn't a mystical force. Karma, as it turned out, was a black woman in a navy suit, wielding the law like a broadsword. The civil settlement was a masterstroke of systemic dismantling, but it was the criminal trial that provided the absolute, unadulterated execution of karma. For Officer Shane Whitaker, the descent from unquestioned authority to total social and financial ruin was terrifyingly rapid. The police union's public disavowal was just the first domino. The second was his wife, Clara. For years, Clara had enjoyed the comfortable suburban life Whitaker's salary and overtime provided. She had defended his tough-on-crime rhetoric at neighborhood barbecues, but she couldn't defend the viral video of her husband violently shoving a prominent black attorney against a car over absolutely nothing. More importantly, she couldn't defend the reality of their frozen bank accounts. When the city agreed to the settlement terms, they stripped Whitaker of his pension and his indemnification. That meant the high-priced private defense attorney he desperately needed to fight the criminal charges of assault and civil rights violations demanded a substantial retainer up front. Weeks before the criminal trial began, Whitaker came home from another humiliating meeting with his lawyer to find Clara's leased SUV gone from the driveway. Inside, the house was half empty. She had left a note on the kitchen island, brief and surgically cold, stating she had filed for divorce and was moving back to her parents' estate. She wasn't going down with his sinking ship. Whitaker sat on his remaining living room chair and wept. It wasn't the tears of a man who realized the error of his ways. It was the pathetic, panicked sobbing of a bully who had finally met a bigger, smarter adversary and realized nobody was coming to save him. The criminal trial of the state versus Shane Whitaker began on a rain-swept Monday. It was a media spectacle that drew national attention. Whitaker sat at the defense table, looking significantly lighter and a decade older. The aggressive buzz cut and the swagger were completely gone, replaced by a cheap gray suit and the hollow, terrified eyes of a cornered animal. Across the aisle, sitting in the front row of the gallery, was Elena Vargas. She didn't miss a single day of the proceedings. She sat perfectly still, dressed in immaculate, dark-toned designer suits, her posture radiating an intimidating serenity. She was the architect of his demise, and she was going to watch the structure collapse. The prosecution, spearheaded by the very district attorney's office Whitaker used to work alongside, showed no mercy. They didn't just play the security footage, they dissected it frame by agonizing frame. They brought in use-of-force experts who methodically destroyed any argument that Whitaker felt a reasonable fear for his safety against a seated woman in a Yale hoodie. But the most devastating moment of the trial came when the prosecution called their star witness, former officer Caleb Torres. Torres had read the writing on the wall. Facing potential accessory charges and the absolute destruction of his own young career, he had cut a deal for total immunity in exchange for his testimony. When Torres took the stand, he couldn't even look at his former partner. "Officer Torres?" the prosecutor asked, pacing before the jury box. "On the night in question, did Ms. Vargas ever make a threatening movement?" "No, sir," Torres replied, his voice trembling slightly, echoing through the packed courtroom. "Did she raise her voice, reach into her pockets, or attempt to flee?" "No." She explicitly stated her rights and asked if she was being detained. And how did Mr. Whitaker react to this legal compliance? Torres swallowed hard, finally shooting a brief, guilty glance toward the defense table. He escalated. He felt insulted that she wasn't following his orders immediately. He said she was one of those people who thought they were untouchable. He grabbed her without cause and applied the cuffs specifically to cause pain. It was punishment, sir, not procedure." A collective gasp rippled through the gallery. Whitaker buried his face in his hands. His defense attorney didn't even bother with a lengthy cross-examination. There was no defense against the truth when it was corroborated by a partner. When it was time for the verdict, the jury deliberated for a short time. The speed of their return was a death knell. Whitaker stood up, his knees shaking so violently they knocked against the heavy oak table. "On the charge of assault under color of law," the foreperson read, their voice loud and clear, "we find the defendant, Shane Whitaker, guilty." Whitaker collapsed back into his chair as if he had been shot. The gavel banged. The courtroom erupted into a low hum of intense chatter. In the front row, Elena Vargas simply closed her eyes, took a slow, deep breath, and allowed a fraction of a smile to grace her lips. The scales of justice, so often tilted, had been violently slammed back into balance. The morning of the sentencing hearing arrived with a bitter, biting chill that seemed to seep straight through the marble pillars of the federal courthouse. Inside the private preparation room of Reynolds, Vargas, and Hayes, Elena Vargas stood before a floor-to-ceiling mirror. She was not wearing her usual courtroom armor, the sharp navy pinstripes or the imposing charcoal wool. Today, she wore a pristine, tailored white suit. Historically, white was the color of the suffragettes, of those demanding systemic upheaval. Today, it was the color of a ghost coming to collect a massive, overdue debt. David Thornton stepped into the room holding a steaming cup of black coffee. He looked at her reflection, a quiet, fierce pride settling in his chest. The courtroom is at capacity. They've opened an overflow room. Every major news network has an anchor on the front steps, and the legal analysts are practically vibrating. They know this is going to set a federal precedent. "Good," Elena said calmly, adjusting her silk cuffs. The faint yellowish outline of a faded bruise was still barely visible on her left wrist, a permanent, physical reminder of the steel that had bitten into her skin. Let them watch. Let every precinct, every corrupt captain, and every power-hungry patrolman in this country watch. When Elena entered the courtroom, the low, anxious roar of chatter instantly died. The air was thick, heavy with the scent of polished wood, floor wax, and nervous sweat. In the gallery sat prominent civil rights leaders, nervous city council members, and a row of off-duty officers looking intensely uncomfortable in their civilian clothes. At the defense table sat Shane Whitaker. The physical transformation was staggering. The bullish, aggressive, chest-out patrolman who had slammed her against a cruiser hood was completely eradicated. In his place sat a hollow, trembling shell of a man. His cheap, off-the-rack gray suit hung loosely off his diminished frame. His skin was sallow, his eyes rimmed with the deep purple of chronic insomnia and profound terror. He kept his gaze firmly glued to the scarred oak of the table. Judge Patricia Langford, a jurist whose reputation for ironclad legal strictness and zero tolerance for courtroom theatrics was legendary, called the court to order. After the preliminary motions were filed and recorded by the court stenographer, she turned her imposing cold gaze to the prosecution table. "Does the victim wish to make a formal impact statement before sentencing is passed?" Judge Langford asked. Elena stood. She didn't walk to the wooden podium. She stood right at the edge of the prosecution table, ensuring there was absolutely no physical barrier between her and the man who had assaulted her. "Your Honor," Elena began, her voice a calm, resonant bell ringing out in the dead silent room. "When Officer Whitaker placed me in handcuffs on a dark street, he did not just arrest a woman walking her dog. He arrested the Constitution. He operated under the dangerous, toxic delusion that his badge was an absolute shield, a blank check to impose his personal prejudices and his unchecked ego upon the public he was sworn to protect." She took a slow step forward. "For hours in a freezing holding cell, I was not a senior partner at a prestigious law firm. I was every voiceless citizen who has ever been bullied, beaten, or falsely imprisoned by a man who fundamentally confused a uniform with supremacy. He targeted me because he believed I lacked the power to fight back." Elena let the silence hang in the air for a long, heavy moment. "But I am not voiceless, and the terror he attempted to instill in me has merely been transmuted into pure, unadulterated justice. I am not asking this court for revenge, Your Honor. I am asking for equilibrium. I am asking this court to remind the precinct and every department watching today that the law is a two-edged sword, and today the blade swings back." Whitaker's private defense attorney, a man who looked visibly exhausted from trying to defend the legally indefensible, stood up for his final plea. In a desperate, highly calculated last-ditch effort to manufacture sympathy and avoid the maximum penalty, he deployed a strategic twist. "Your Honor," the defense attorney pleaded, his voice intentionally cracking with emotion, "my client's life has already been utterly, comprehensively destroyed. His wife has abandoned him, his home has been foreclosed upon, and he is facing absolute personal bankruptcy. But more tragically, his elderly mother, living in an assisted care facility, was recently diagnosed with late-stage dementia. Mr. Whitaker was her sole financial provider. Stripping him of his freedom doesn't just punish a disgraced cop. It condemns an innocent, ailing woman to become a ward of the state." A low murmur rippled through the gallery. It was a classic emotional manipulation tactic designed to soften the judge's gavel. Whitaker buried his face in his hands, his shoulders heaving as he sobbed audibly for the cameras. But Elena had anticipated this exact play. She casually slid a single, highlighted sheet of paper across the table to the lead prosecutor, who immediately jumped to his feet. "Objection, Your Honor. Relevance and severe factual inaccuracy," the prosecutor stated sharply, his voice cutting through the manufactured sympathy. "While the defense attempts to pull the court's heartstrings, we have verified financial records subpoenaed during the discovery phase. Mr. Whitaker hasn't contributed a single dollar to his mother's care facility in years. Her medical care is entirely subsidized by a state Medicaid program. This is a fabricated, highly cynical plea for leniency built on a foundation of perjury." The gasp in the courtroom was audible. The twist of sympathy snapped like a dry twig under a heavy boot. Whitaker's head jerked up, his eyes wide with horror as he realized his own lawyer's desperation had just been expertly weaponized against him. The defense attorney slowly sat down, violently rubbing his temples, knowing he had just lost the judge completely. Judge Langford's expression darkened into a scowl that could have frozen boiling water. She looked down from the high bench, her disgust palpable and heavy. "Mr. Whitaker," Judge Langford said, her voice dripping with absolute contempt. "You sat in this courtroom and allowed your counsel to lie about a sick, elderly woman in a pathetic attempt to save your own skin. It speaks to the absolute rot at the core of your character. You operated under the delusion of untouchability. You thought a badge made you a king in Oak Creek Estates, but this courtroom is the great equalizer." She picked up her heavy silver pen, violently checking off a box on the sentencing guidelines document. "A momentary lapse in judgment is a speeding ticket," she continued, her voice echoing off the marble walls. "What you committed was a calculated, egotistical, and violent abuse of power under the color of law. You are a disgrace to the Shield, a massive financial liability to your city, and a clear, present danger to the public trust. Therefore, on the federal charge of civil rights violations and assault under color of law, I sentence you to 96 months, 8 full years, in a maximum security federal penitentiary. This sentence will be served without the possibility of early parole." The number hit the room like a physical shockwave. 8 years hard time. For a former, highly publicized dirty cop, a federal penitentiary was essentially a daily, brutal fight for physical survival. "Bailiffs," Judge Langford ordered, slamming her wooden gavel down with the terrifying crack of a rifle shot. "Remand the prisoner into custody immediately." 2 massive federal marshals stepped forward from the shadows. They didn't use the gentle procedural touch often afforded to former law enforcement. They grabbed Whitaker by the biceps, hauling him roughly to his feet. They wrenched his arms behind his back. The loud, sharp, metallic click-click of the heavy steel cuffs snapping shut resonated loudly through the hushed room. It was the exact, terrifying sound Whitaker had intentionally forced Elena to hear on that dark street. Karma had finally arrived, and she was entirely merciless. Whitaker let out a wretched, guttural wail as he was dragged toward the heavy oak side door, looking back over his shoulder one last time. Elena simply watched him go, her face a mask of serene, unbothered calm. The systemic fallout outside the courthouse was swift, brutal, and historic. The $30 million settlement drawn directly from the police pension fund caused an absolute mutiny within the ranks. The police union tried to organize a strike, but the city's residents turned on them with unprecedented fury. The public had seen the security video. They knew exactly why the money was gone. Suddenly, patrol officers realized that covering for the bad apples on their shifts would directly cost them their own retirements and their children's college funds. The infamous blue wall of silence didn't just slowly crack. It was pulverized into dust overnight. Self-preservation forced accountability. Captain Victor Lang was unceremoniously fired the following morning. He lost his prestigious command, his glowing reputation, and his dignity, eventually reduced to taking a humiliating, low-paying job managing night security at a rundown shopping mall in the next county over. Officer Caleb Torres, the young partner who had testified against Whitaker to save himself, found his life equally ruined. Despite his legal immunity, he was branded a traitor by the old guard and a coward by the public. The psychological weight of the precinct's total collapse drove him to resign immediately. He quietly packed his bags, moved across the country to a small, remote town, and never put on a uniform again. The precinct was placed under strict federal oversight. The Department of Justice mandated a total systemic overhaul. Body cameras were hardwired to external servers to prevent manual, on-site shutoffs, and Reynolds, Vargas, and Hayes was retained at an astronomical consulting fee to personally rewrite the city's use of force and detention protocols. Later, on a warm autumn evening, Elena Vargas walked down the familiar, winding gravel path toward the neighborhood lake. She was wearing a faded, oversized Yale law hoodie, worn-in gray sweatpants, and a pair of scuffed running shoes. Her golden retriever, Barnaby, trotted happily at her side, his tail wagging excitedly as he chased falling amber leaves. She reached the exact wrought iron bench where the nightmare had begun all those months ago. She sat down, breathing in the cool, sharp air, watching the late afternoon sun paint the rippling water in brilliant shades of copper, gold, and violet. The quiet, heavy crunch of tires on gravel broke the evening silence. A black and white cruiser from the newly reformed precinct rolled slowly down the path, its headlights cutting through the dusk. Elena didn't tense her shoulders. She didn't reach down to pull her dog's leash tighter. She simply rested her arms comfortably on the back of the cold iron bench and watched the vehicle approach. The cruiser slowed to a deliberate crawl as it passed her. The driver's side window rolled down smoothly. Behind the wheel sat a young, newly promoted sergeant. He looked over at the woman sitting alone in the baggy hoodie. He recognized the clothing. He recognized the face that had completely dismantled and subsequently rebuilt his entire department from the ground up. He didn't hit the blinding spotlight. He didn't park his car. He didn't demand identification or question her presence in the affluent neighborhood. He simply raised a gloved hand, touching the brim of his cap in a quiet gesture of profound, unadulterated respect. He offered a polite, deferential nod, rolled the window back up, and carefully drove on, ensuring her hard-won peace remained entirely undisturbed. True power does not need to shout. It does not require intimidation, raised voices, or the cold, biting steel of handcuffs to force blind compliance. The ultimate tragedy of arrogant men like Shane Whitaker is the toxic delusion that a piece of metal pinned to their chest grants them invulnerability, blinding them to the reality that true authority is rooted in the law, not the ego. Elena Vargas didn't just defeat a corrupt, abusive officer. She methodically dismantled the systemic machinery that enabled his cruelty, proving that when the oppressed possess the intellect, the patience, and the leverage to fight back, karma isn't just a mystical cosmic concept. It is a brutal, measurable, and permanent force of nature. The scales of justice may often rust with societal complacency, but when wielded by a steady, uncompromising hand, they possess the power to crush the heaviest of corruptions, leaving behind a silence that finally, truly, sounds like peace.